Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Of Bhagavad Gita in the study of consciousness and discussing consciousness, some input from the field of science as to the non-material nature of consciousness. So I thought we could start with a verse from Bhagavad Gita and then proceed from there. But first, why are we discussing consciousness? There's many topics we could be discussing. So, for example, when there's a disease, we've all experienced disease. So when there's some disease, so many symptoms are there, so many difficulties are there, what is the most proper approach to solving the disease?
The root cause.
To go to the root cause. I bet you're not a doctor, right? Right? You don't have to have your MD degree to figure that one out. So, whenever there's a problem, the solution is to go to the root cause. For example, perhaps you've had this experience, I know I've had this experience, where, say in school, you're writing out some big, long mathematical equation, proof, or whatever, and you end up with the wrong answer. Because you're given at the end, you're given what the right answer is supposed to be, and you realize, oops, I got the wrong answer. You know, there might have been 20 steps to the whole thing, and you came up with the wrong answer. What could be a possible cause of that? You have to keep retracing your steps, right? Go back, go back, go back. And lo and behold, you find out that the very first line, there was a mistake. Maybe just an innocent mistake. You started off 2 + 2 = 5. Right? We all know 2 + 2 = 4. By making that one little mistake in the first step, it propagates, sometimes exponentially, to the point where you come to the bottom line and you're way off the mark. Like way off the mark. One little mistake. And all the other steps you did very nicely. So the Krishna consciousness movement is actually making a challenge to the materialistic way of life. Has anybody noticed that there's like a lot of problems in the world? Have you noticed that? So there's a bumper sticker, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a bumper sticker that says, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Understand? If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And there's much to be outraged about in this world. Unlimited types of exploitation, cheating. Srimad Bhagavatam states that in this age of Kali Yuga, the 4 legs of religiosity, like a chair stands on 4 legs, a table usually 4 legs. The 4 legs of religiosity are being destroyed or already destroyed in this age. One of them is austerity. Instead of being austere, people are practicing just like boundless type of sense gratification, just whimsical sense gratification. Another one is mercy. Instead of being compassionate and merciful to others, instead we're practicing exploitation. Another is cleanliness in our habits, in our words, in our thoughts. Instead, now anything goes, and one can say anything, think anything, and do anything, no matter how filthy it is. And the last one is truthfulness, that one can lie over the simplest little things, just to cheat. So, the Krishna consciousness movement is challenging the materialistic way of life by challenging the very first line of their calculation. And what is that very first line? In the first line is where you have your premise. If A is true, then, if the first line, we are going to accept as true the first line. And because this first line, A, is true, then what follows, logically, B follows. So that must be true. And then logically that follows C, and that must be true. It's all based on accepting the validity of the first line. So the Krishna consciousness movement is challenging materialistic life by challenging the very first line in the calculation. And what is that first line that is being accepted as axiomatically true, and that we're challenging is not axiomatically true? Well, that's step number B. Step 2 is, I am this body. And it's the logical progression from the first step, which we're challenging is axiomatically wrong. And what is that? Well, that's, again, following the axiom. They start off, materialistic life starts off with this axiom, which the Krishna consciousness movement is challenging. Well, he already said that. That's actually this next step. The axiom. Well, no, that's also the axiomatic truth, so-called truth, that we're challenging is this statement that they start off with, that consciousness
came from matter.
Yes, that consciousness is a product of matter. And because they start off the formula 2 + 2 = 5, that error propagates exponentially throughout the rest of the proof, and you come up with an answer at the end that is way off the mark. And that is why the Krishna consciousness movement is proposing that is why all the problems in the world exist. Whether it's economic, social, political, relationships, financial, environmental, ecological, whatever. All the problems in the world boil down to this first line of the materialistic, formula. That consciousness is a product of matter. So we wanted to start with a verse from Bhagavad Gita. From the very beginning. What's happening in Bhagavad Gita? Arjuna is having a big problem. He's about to enter battle, but as he enters battle, he sees family members on the other side. He has a nervous breakdown. He has an anxiety attack and says, I cannot fight this war. And his anxiety breaks down to the reason for this all this anxiety is what is called an identity crisis. Arjuna can't figure out what to do because he can't figure out what his identity is. On one hand, he says, I am a warrior. And when he identifies himself as a warrior, then he says, yes, I should fight this war because it's my duty, I'm a state warrior. I can't just go AWOL. This is my duty, so this is what I should do. But then at the very next moment, he identifies himself as a family member. And when he identifies himself as a family member, he can't fight the war because, lo and behold, those are family members on the other side. Who wants to fight with family members? That's not proper. So he's in a tug-of-war. Because of this identity crisis, he can't figure out what his true identity is. So in that frustrated, you can imagine how frustrating that must be. We all have these experiences where we can't make a decision because you feel like I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. You know, you have a conflict of interest, right? In the choice making. So in that very conflicted state, Arjuna turns to Krishna and says, I can find no means to solve my difficulty. I accept you as my guru. I want to be your disciple. Please instruct me. Tell me definitely what I should do. So Krishna now begins to speak to Arjuna. And the very first lesson he gives to Arjuna is, hey, Arjuna, you know what your problem is? You don't know who you are. How are you supposed to make a decision when you don't know who you are? So he begins his instructions in the second chapter by instructing Arjuna that, guess what? You are not this body. This body, yes, this body is a warrior. Yes, this body is a family member. But that's not your ultimate identity. You are different from the body. So then he goes into a little discussion about consciousness, the nature of consciousness. So I wanted to look at chapter 2, text 17. And this is Krishna's continuing with his talk to Arjuna. Okay, so 2.17. Krishna says, no, that which pervades the entire body is indestructible. No one is able to destroy the imperishable soul. So he's beginning his instructions on the indestructible nature of the non-material self. So in the purport, I'll just read a couple of parts from the purport. Prabhupada says, this verse more clearly explains the real nature of the soul, which is spread all over the body. Anyone can understand what is spread all over the body. It is consciousness. I pinch my little toe and I can feel it. I pinch my earlobe, I can feel it. Consciousness is spread all over the body. Everyone is conscious of the pains and pleasures of the body in part or as a whole. This spreading of consciousness is limited within one's own body. The pains and pleasures of one body are unknown to another. Therefore, each and every body is the embodiment of an individual soul. And the symptom of the soul's presence is perceived as individual consciousness. Prabhupada goes on to explain that the soul is atomic in size, smaller than the material atoms. And he explains that the yoga system is actually meant for controlling the errors within the body so that gradually one can actually come to realize the spiritual nature of the self. He says that the energy of the soul or consciousness is spread all over the body, just like when one takes medicine. They simply ingest a little pill, then the effects of that medicine spread all over the body. I'll just read this last few sentences here. Prabhupada says, such atomic particles of the spirit whole are compared to the sunshine molecules. What's being explained here is that we, the spirit soul, are like one atom of consciousness compared to the supreme original consciousness, Krishna. We're like one little sample. So such atomic particles of spirit whole are compared to the sunshine molecules. In the sunshine, there are innumerable radiant molecules. Similarly, the fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord are atomic sparks of the rays of the Supreme Lord, called by the name Prabha, or superior energy. Neither Vedic knowledge nor modern science denies the existence of the spirit soul in the body. And the science of the soul is explicitly described in Bhagavad Gita by the personality of Godhead himself. Now, Prabhupada made one generous statement here. He said that modern science does not deny the existence of the soul within the body. I think we all have quite differing experiences of that. So, one defect, there's many defects, but one defect of modern science is that it has actually deviated from the proper path of science. What is the proper path of science? The proper path of science is one makes observations. Based on those observations, they come up with a hypothesis or a theory on how to explain those observations. One designs an experiment to test that theory. By doing that experiment, one collects some more data, some more observations, and those observations either verify the theory, which means, okay, it stays on the books as a bona fide theory, or the observations deny the theory, find fault with the theory, in which case one has to throw that theory away or adjust it to some degree or another. So one difficulty in modern science today is that there has been a great, actually quite a few personalities who have kind of hijacked science into the field of what's called scientism. And scientism refers to the improper practice of science whereby they go out of bounds. It refers to persons making observations and from those observations coming to unjustifiable conclusions and stating that these conclusions are actually the truth. For example, science claims that we have searched like anything to find the existence of the non-material conscious self. We have tried like anything to find the existence of God. And what do we find? Nothing. We don't come up with any evidence for God, and we don't come up with any evidence for the non-material self. Therefore, they wrongly conclude. Now this is where scientism comes in. Now that's scientific, to say, I haven't collected any evidence to support such and such premise. But then scientism comes in and says, therefore, consciousness is a product of matter. Therefore, there is no God. Krishna in Bhagavad Gita is proposing that consciousness is not material. And therefore, where is the question of perceiving it through a mechanistic paradigm? How can you use by definition, how can you use a mechanistic paradigm to research something which isn't material? So this is the difficulty. So there's this one magazine called Origins, Higher Dimensions in Science. And there's one article here. This is a magazine that was put together by some of Srila Prabhupada's disciples to review different theories in modern science that deal with origins, like origins of the universe, origins of consciousness, origins of life, origins of species, etc. And make a little challenge to show that the theories of modern science are lacking terribly when they try to discuss topics such as origins, because they have tried to go outside of their own parameters. They're trying to research something which is outside of their own field, their mechanistic paradigm. So one article in this magazine is called The Mystery of Consciousness. And the authors review many theories that persons had put forth over the last 2 centuries to try to explain the nature of the non-physical mind, or what they hear is the non-physical mind. So many outrageous statements have been made. We're going to look at this one. This is by a person named John B. Watson. He's a professor of psychology at Johns Hopkins University. And he makes the following statement about consciousness. He writes, "It, consciousness, has never been seen, touched, smelled, tasted, or moved. It is a plain assumption, just as unprovable as the old concept of the soul." Well, there might be a good reason why consciousness hasn't been seen, touched, smelled, tasted, or moved. And what is that good reason?
It's a symptom.
I'm sorry?
It's a symptom. So you cannot actually perceive it.
Consciousness is a symptom of the soul, yes. But why can it not be touched, smelled, tasted, heard?
Because that would be material.
Exactly. Our material senses, we have 5 senses for acquiring knowledge. Our eyes can see, and our nose can smell, and our tongue can taste, and our ears can hear, and our tactile sense can touch. Our senses and the extensions of our senses, like, microscopes and NMR machines and, whatever, infrared detectors. The extensions of our senses and the senses can only detect those things which are material. So to say that we have not touched, tasted, smelled, etc., consciousness, and therefore it does not exist. How did he say? It is a plain assumption, just as unprovable as the old concept of the soul. So what he and many, many others are guilty of is that lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. You understand? Lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. You can't have so-called material evidence of something which isn't material. And why is it that built into the scientific theories and formulas, it's assumed at the get-go that there's only two things that exist: matter and the laws that govern matter, and that there's absolutely nothing else in reality. Why is that assumption held? And remember our math proof that we went through. If you start off 2 + 2 = 5, everything else that follows, even though it's a logical progression, it can be logical, but it can be wrong. Just like 2 + 2 = 5. Well, okay, then the logical progression from that is that 2 times 2 + 2 = 10. Well, that's wrong. We know 2 times 2 + 2 = 8. So it was a logical progression, but it doesn't make it right. And why is it not right? Because the premise was wrong. So the premise of modern science is that there's only two things that exist: matter and the laws that govern matter. Another person, let me find that here. Some scientists, as they're doing their research, they start having their doubts about whether consciousness is material. So this person, he's a Nobel laureate physicist named Eugene Wigner, and he says there are two kinds of reality or existence: the existence of my consciousness and the reality or existence of everything else. The latter reality is not absolute, but only relative. So Eugene Wigner started having doubts about whether consciousness is material. Thomas Huxley said that there's a third thing in the universe. There's matter and there's forces. He says there's a third thing in the universe, to wit, consciousness, which I cannot see to be matter or force. So now we might question, well, what are we to do? When you go to school, the only thing that's taught is the mechanistic paradigm. I believe Jutakharma Prabhu was here last week, and I don't know if he spoke about this when he was here, but I know he likes to make this point that theories are theories until they're shown by collection of data and observation to be wrong. They stand as a theory. And there can be many theories coexisting. So should we not give equal playtime to all theories? I don't know if he discussed this when he was here, but there's the mechanistic theory that life is a product of matter. And then there's the theory that life is non-material, eternal consciousness. Those are two theories. Why are they not given equal playtime in our schools and universities? There's actually an unfair representation of theories in our educational system, which, not trying to get into any conspiracy theories or anything, but which, if you really analyze it with a little bit of intelligence, it becomes quite clear that there's a reason for that. And it comes from the top. That those who are ultimately in charge of the educational systems want to indoctrinate persons from preschool all the way up through PhD that life is material. And with that so-called understanding that consciousness is a product of matter, then anything goes. Then if I want to propagate genocide, then what is the problem? Life is just a bunch of chemicals. Just like when you go into your kitchen and there's some food sitting here and there's a pile of dirt sitting here, you want to get rid of the dirt, right? Well, they're both just a pile of chemicals. This pile of chemicals is shaped like, a slice of pizza. And this pile of chemicals is shaped like a pile of what you call dirt. So why do you discriminate and throw the pile of dirt away, but keep the slice of pizza? They're just both a pile of chemicals. So you can enjoy the piece of pizza, you can put the slice, the pile of dirt, you want to get rid of. Similarly, life is just a bag of chemicals. So if we want to commit, for example, genocide, what's the problem? I'm calling this a pile of dirt, and I'm calling this a pile of something worthwhile. What about abortion? Oh, it's just a bunch of chemicals. It's just a growth inside. There's no non-material life there. Get rid of it. And onward and out. War, everything. Exploitation, everything. All the problems of the world boil down to this premise that life is material. So now we might ask the question, being members of the Krishna consciousness movement, what can we do about it? Okay, maybe, in my private life, I hold this belief that, because I follow Bhagavad Gita, so I hold on to this understanding that life is non-material, spiritual, like that. But, okay, that's your belief. But what are you doing to help others to understand that? How can we change the paradigm that's being taught? So some scientists have actually made efforts to collect data which supports the theory that life is non-material, that consciousness is non-material. Some scientists have actually collected data which pokes holes in the theory that consciousness is material. And as we said, you could have the most wonderful theory, and you could have thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence that support that theory. But as soon as you come up with one piece of evidence that contradicts that theory, that whole theory is shot down. Right? How can you keep the theory standing when you found a piece of data that legitimately contradicts it and challenges it? So I just thought we would mention a couple of studies by scientists who these studies have actually shown data which contradicts the mechanistic paradigm when it comes to the study of consciousness. And although these evidences are there, the theory that consciousness is simply a product of matter still stands. So our challenge is, or our complaint is, that scientism is not honest. It's a cheating proposition. So, one field of study was in near-death experiences. Near-death experiences called NDEs. And let me just find that. Yeah, so this was by a Dr. Michael B. Shabam. He's a cardiologist and a professor at Emory University Medical School. And he was skeptical, like anything, of these NDEs, near-death experiences. But he kept hearing, occasionally he would hear his cardiac patients explain to him that they actually saw their surgery. They were having open heart surgery, for example, and they would later tell Dr. Sabam that I saw you doing the surgery. And he would be like, what are you talking about? And they would say, well, I guess it was a near-death experience. I left my body. I mean, I don't know how to explain it. All I know is, so he, being very skeptical, decided to not believe those people. But after he heard too many cases like that, he decided to devise a little investigation. So he did that, and he got two groups of heart patients. And he had a control group, and then he had the other group. And the control group was made up of persons, a few dozen. He had like 2 or 3 dozen people. And this group was made up of persons who did not make any claim to have an out-of-body experience. And he then interviewed them. Could you please explain to me what the surgical procedure was? Most of them couldn't explain anything. They were like, what do you mean, explain the surgical procedure? I was under anesthesia. I don't know. I just know what you told me, that you were going to cut this and do that. And he said a few actually tried to explain the procedure, and they made very gross mistakes. Then the second group was composed of 2 or 3 dozen persons who did claim, after their cardiac surgery, had made some claim of having an out-of-body experience. So he interviewed them could you please explain what the surgical procedure involved? And out of those, let's see, what was there were 32 persons. And out of those, 26 gave visual descriptions, giving details corresponding to the medical records of their particular, resuscitation and operation. So 26 out of 32 were able to give an accurate description of what was going on. And some were actually able to say what was being spoken by the doctors around the operation table. So he did several investigations like this. And after doing so, he came to actually now believe that the conscious self is something independent of the physical body. He came to the following conclusion concerning the mind-brain question. He said, if the human brain is actually composed of 2 fundamental elements, the mind and the brain, then could the near-death crisis event somehow trigger a transient splitting of the mind from the brain in many individuals? My own beliefs on this matter are leaning in this direction. The out-of-body hypothesis simply seems to fit best with the data at hand. Could the mind, which splits apart from the physical brain, be in essence the soul, which continues to exist after final bodily death, according to some religious doctrines? As I see it, this is the ultimate question that has been raised by reports of NDE, near-death experiences. So like that, many people have continued such research into the present. Another field of research, which is very interesting, is past life remembrances. Because if we accept this premise that consciousness is non-material, then the logical step that follows that is that consciousness is independent of the body. And consciousness can exist in its full strength outside of the body. And consciousness can continue to exist even when the body is destroyed at death. This then would give credence to the picture or theory of reincarnation. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, that as we're constantly changing our body in this life, from babyhood to childhood to middle age to old age, the soul is always transmigrating through so many bodies in this one short life. Similarly, at death, the soul takes another body. That's where he starts his instructions with Arjuna. If his first instruction is wrong, then we can throw out the entire Bhagavad Gita, because that is his first instruction in 2.13. That's a very important verse to learn. And if that premise is correct, then everything else in Bhagavad Gita, which logically follows that premise, has to be accepted as truth. So one Dr. Ian Stevenson, who is he's passed away several years ago, but up until right till the end of his life, he was the Carlson Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He was a very well-published researcher. He did years and decades of intense research because he was shocked by hearing about past life remembrances. He did not grow up in a culture that supported the idea of reincarnation. So without reincarnation, how could you possibly have a past life remembrance? So after hearing too many cases of past life remembrances, he said, well, I'm going to scientifically investigate this because I'm a psychiatrist. I can do such investigations, and I'm going to prove it wrong. He started off wanting to disprove these claims of past life remembrances. He did so much research, interviewing, particularly those that would be interviewed would be small children. Because adults, the longer we're around, the more we hear. We can do research. Back then there wasn't the internet, so research was a little bit more difficult. But adults can travel, adults can read and hear and, get influenced by so many sources. Small children, they're living at home, they don't know how to read. Again, there wasn't the internet and all this. They cannot come up with things that adults can come up with. So Ian Stevenson did research primarily with young children. And he found all over the world, not just, in Asia, where reincarnation is more believed in, he came up with too many accounts of young children who could give very explicit details of past lives. And he underwent research to try to prove whether these past life remembrances could be true or if they're just little stories that the children make up. So he would do things like interview the child, get the story, verify that their parents, family members, neighbors, etc., had no way of saying these types of things to the child, then going to that place where the child claimed to formerly be a member of, a resident of, and researching to see if there were artifacts, if you will, that supported the child's story. So many, many stories he was able to verify as being legitimate. One is an example, there's this girl named Sukla, and she's a small girl living in Bengal, daughter of a railway worker. And she started insisting that she had a past life as a woman named Mana. And she described Mana's husband, Mana's child. She had a small baby, and that she had died abruptly and prematurely, leaving behind a young husband and a young child. She explained to Dr. Ian Stevenson the details of the layout of the house that she lived in some remote village. She described details about the family members, etc., etc. So Ian Stevenson took this girl to that place. First he went there and checked it out, and there was indeed a village named Batpara, which she claimed to be a resident of. He then took her and her family to that village and had her lead the way. So she led the way into the village. She turned on certain roads. She led them to the house and said, "This is the house that I lived in." She came to the house and she said, "Oh, wait a minute. The front door used to be over here. Why is the front door over here? The front door is supposed to be over here." He noted that down. Then he had arranged for there to be a couple of dozen of adults, strangers, not that they'd never met, the family knew none of these people. He had about a dozen or a couple of dozen of random adults standing there. Out of that crowd of adults, she ran up to the person who was her husband in the last life and identified him. She identified her small baby, who is now a few years older, named Minu. She identified the mother-in-law. She identified the brother-in-law. And like this, out of a group of about 24 adults, she picked out 6 or 7 that were the actual family members of this Mana, who she claimed to be in the previous life. Then Dr. Ian Stevenson interviewed those family members, and he said she complained that the front door isn't where it was supposed to be, so that's why we're thinking maybe she got the wrong house. And they said, "No, we renovated the house a couple of years ago, and the front door indeed was in this position previously, but now the front door is in the current position." She identified it correctly, that the front door should be right here. So like this, Ian Stevenson did so much research to verify stories of past life remembrances from children. And now you might say, "Oh, well, what does that have to do with anything?" Well, this is strong evidence that the conscious self continues to exist after the demise of the body and can go into another body. So although scientific data can never prove the existence of the soul or prove the existence of God, he, Ian Stevenson, has volumes of books of collected data supporting this idea of reincarnation, of past life remembrances. And similarly, since he's passed away, his graduate students who are now, graduated into the position of full-fledged researchers themselves are continuing that research. Another area that they've done research in is persons who have past life remembrances of violent deaths. For example, I was shot, somebody killed me, and in my past life I was killed and the bullet went in here and went out there. I remember the bullet went in here and went out here. And they can do some testing on that person, and they see that the person has a birthmark exactly where the bullet supposedly went in, and a birthmark in the area where the bullet went out from the past body. And then they do research into the records of, the death records, right, of the past, and verify, yes, there was a person named such, and on such and such a day they were killed, and the autopsy showed that the bullet went in here and went out there. And they came up with countless, so many, many, many cases of persons with birthmarks or birth defects that exactly mirrored what that person said was their violent death in a past life. So like this, much evidence has been collected to strongly support the theory of the existence of a non-material conscious self. And now we might ask, well, who cares? What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, we chant Hare Krishna and we don't care about that. Well, the reason that we care is because most people in the world, they will not take to the practice of Krishna consciousness just because we try to turn them on to it. You know, hey, come on over here, check this out. You might like it. Come chant Hare Krishna, and here, read Bhagavad Gita. Oh, they might come and chant Hare Krishna and experience a higher taste by chanting Hare Krishna. They might read Bhagavad Gita and find it to be terribly interesting. But on the hours when they're not chanting Hare Krishna and not reading Bhagavad Gita, they are being fed the mechanistic paradigm's conclusion that life is a bag of chemicals. I have met and personally spoken with persons who consider themselves practicing bhakti yogis who are still bewildered by the conclusions of scientism. So we have to approach Krishna consciousness not just sentimentally. I mean, that's not encouraged to be a sentimental follower of bhakti yoga. What's encouraged, Krishna encourages Arjuna to use his intelligence. He actually tells Arjuna at the end of Bhagavad Gita, right before Arjuna decides to go to battle, one of his last things that he says to Arjuna is, now you've heard everything I've told you. It was a long discussion, you've heard it all. Please analyze what I just told you, digest it, and then choose what you wish to do. Use your intelligence. Is what I presented to you, does it make sense? Does it appeal to your intelligence? If not, don't just be a blind follower. I'll go through the whole thing again if you want me to. He's that patient. So similarly, we have to be equipped. We have to be equipped to, for example, Prabhupada says in his preface to the Srimad Bhagavatam, that this Srimad Bhagavatam is so nicely presented that if one simply gives it a careful read, the reader will be sufficiently equipped to protect themselves from the onslaught of atheists. And over and above this, the reader will be able to convince others to accept as a concrete principle the existence of God. So Prabhupada wants us to be equipped to protect ourselves from the onslaught of atheists. So this Origin magazine, this is just a brief overview of many theories in modern science. Theories in modern science which have taken as their mission to show that the origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of consciousness, etc., is simply material. And so the devotees who put this magazine together intended to take each article and expand it into at least a 300-page they put this magazine together so that each and every one of us can read this. It's written for laymen. You don't have to be a scientist to read it. But the devotees wanted us to read this so that we could be equipped to protect ourselves from the atheistic theories that are diametrically opposed to the genuine practice of Krishna consciousness. Without proper knowledge, our practice of Krishna consciousness is just sentimental. We cannot build a fire with one hand and with the other hand pour water on it. We can't have our foot in two boats.
So I figured
We have to either accept Krishna's conclusions or we have to accept the conclusions of scientism. But we can't be devoted to both. So the practice of Krishna consciousness gives us the opportunity to go beyond just theory, belief, even intellectual knowledge. It gives us the opportunity to have an experience. And that's what chanting Hare Krishna is all about. For you, as a practitioner, to actually experience our own non-material nature of consciousness. It might not happen at the beginning. So at the beginning, we're going on by faith. We're going on by intellect. And that's okay. That's why we have to have our intellect, properly educated. Because our practice of bhakti yoga is mostly going to be fueled by our intellect and reasoning. But at a certain point, we're going to get our own realizations that will fuel our practice. So today is the auspicious day of Ram Vijayotsava. It is the day when Lord Ramachandra killed Ravana, the big, big demon Ravana. How many heads did Ravana have? 10 heads. So he was way more intelligent than us. Even you might be big, big genius with one brain. He had 10 brains. And he was not living in Kali Yuga like us. So intelligence was very big in previous ages. Times 10 is what he had. So with his big intelligence, he reasoned that he was God and that he could take anything he wanted for his own enjoyment. So he kidnapped Mother Sita from Lord Ram. Lord Ram obviously came to fight Ravana at one point. And what was the difficulty when Ravana's heads were getting severed from his torso? What would happen when one of Ravana's heads would get cut off? Another one would grow back. If you cut off 2 heads, then 2 heads would grow back. So it became obvious that Ravana was not going to be defeated by cutting off his heads. So then what did Lord Ram do to kill Ravana? What was the, eventual death of Ravana? What did Lord Ram do? With? Yes, he shot one arrow into the heart of Ravana, and that took the whole demon down. So similarly, modern science, which we call scientism, has this one problem, or this one characteristic, that they don't go down easy. Even you slash one theory and prove it to be wrong, because like I said, all you need is one piece of evidence to show that that theory is wrong, and it's shot down. You don't need to have 500 pieces of evidence. If you can have one piece of evidence that counters the theory, then that theory is finished. but they don't go down easy. So despite the theory being slashed at its roots and shown to be incorrect, then they come up with a new theory to take its place. Right? Just like Ravana. Okay, you cut one of my heads off? No problem, I'll sprout another one. You cut off 3 of my heads? No problem, I'll manifest 3 more. And it would just go on unlimitedly to no end. That's what's going on in the materialistic paradigm today. Every time a theory is shot down and shown to be wrong at its core, they either deny it, they deny defeat. Prabhupada used this example. Two people are arguing. How did that piece of paper get cut? We have a sheet of paper here and it's cut in the middle. How did it get cut? And one person says, it was cut with scissors. And the other person says, no, it was cut with a knife. No, it was cut with scissors. No, it was cut with a knife. And they go on arguing, scissors, knife, scissors, knife. So the person who was saying it was cut with a knife, he takes the person who was saying it was cut with scissors and throws him into the lake so that he'll drown and shut up, right? You know? So I'm going to win because that guy's going to drown. So as the person is drowning, he's obviously defeated, right? He's got 1 breath left. He sticks his hand above the surface of the water and goes like this. So Prabhupada said similarly, even though the atheistic scientists, who are not scientists, they're followers of scientism, even they're proved wrong, they're defeated, they won't admit defeat, and they'll go down like this. So, as Ravana's heads could not be permanently severed because he'd grow another one, similarly, modern science, despite defeating their theories, they'll come up with another theory. So, it is not our intention, it is not our foolishness to think that through doing scientific investigations, such as Dr. Sabam did with near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, or that Dr. Stevenson did with past life remembrances and reincarnation, we are not foolishly thinking that if we gather up tons and tons and tons of evidence like this, that we're going to chop off all the heads of scientism. Because we know those heads will simply grow back with a different flavor. But to protect innocent students, and we are one of those innocent students, from so much indoctrination, we need to feed our intelligence with evidence like this, which supports Krishna's axiomatic truths that he speaks in Bhagavad Gita. But the real defeat of atheism and materialism doesn't come by bombarding the brain. It is actually an activity of the heart. So each and every one of us, we need to get realization in the heart. And we have to be able to impart to others conviction on the level of the heart. And when I say conviction, it means some experience. So this is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission. And it begins with cleansing the heart. The heart is contaminated right now with so many ill-conceived and improperly placed notions that it needs to be cleansed. So this chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, is both the means and the goal. It is the means for cleansing the heart of all the material contamination. And when the heart is cleansed, then the chanting of Hare Krishna is also the goal, because in that pure chanting, the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra with a pure heart, a purified heart, then one actually experiences the positive side of actual spiritual life, which is non-material. Then one can experience that world, Goloka Vrindavan, where Krishna and Radha reside, and where we're meant to reside in a loving relationship with them. The heart has to get cleansed, and the positive experience replaces the material experience. So that is a brief overview of some of the work that the devotees have done with this Origins magazine, and how this magazine is meant to assist us in our understanding of Bhagavad Gita, to protect us from the onslaught of atheists. And anybody who cares to have a copy, we actually brought additional copies to give out to people who would like to take one of these home and study it. 'Cause this was the very first piece of literature that I read when I got introduced to Krishna consciousness, because I was a student and I considered myself a scientist. And I was invited to a vegetarian dinner. It was right across the street from the chemistry building at the University of Illinois in Champaign, right across the street from my chemistry building. There was a little coffee house, and there was a vegetarian dinner being put on there, and it was by the Hare Krishna devotees from Chicago. So a friend of mine invited me to the dinner. I said, "Oh, what's that? Is there a vegetarian club on campus that's doing this?" He said, "No, it's the Hare Krishnas." And I was like, "Oh, what do the Hare Krishnas have to do with vegetarianism?" Because I didn't really know what they were. Anyway, I went to the dinner. I loved the food. The prasadam was just fantastic. They were doing it once a week on a Wednesday evening. So that was my first time to go. So then I decided to go again a second time. And then I went a third time. And on that third time, I decided to take home a piece of literature. And I looked at the literature, and I was like, what? Is it in English? I don't read books that aren't in English. I only know English. So I saw Bhagavad Gita, and I couldn't even pronounce the title. I thought it was in Arabic or Russian or something. I couldn't pronounce the title of Srimad Bhagavatam. On the front cover it said Srimad Bhagavatam, and then it said by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I couldn't distinguish what was the author and what was the title, what language. So I was looking at the book table with all these strange titles, and then I saw this magazine. And it said Origins, Higher Dimensions in Science. I saw another magazine that said Back to Godhead. And I said, oh, that's about God. I'm not sure that's for me. And then I saw this one, Origins, Higher Dimensions in Science. Oh, I can read that one. I'm a scientist. So I picked up this magazine and took it home, and I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. And I read the entire magazine in one sitting. Probably took me about 3 hours. And I felt like every single article made total sense. And I totally agreed with all the conclusions that the authors came to. And they kept mentioning this book, Bhagavad Gita, that I couldn't pronounce the title of. So then I said, I have to get that book. I don't know what it is, but I got to get that book. And the last chapter, or the last article of the magazine, introduces what's called higher dimensional science. And in that article is where the authors very forthcomingly reveal some of the tenets of the spiritual science. And that's when I said, I have to read Bhagavad Gita. So the next week I got my copy of Bhagavad Gita, and the rest is history.